Hello! In this video I want to share top 5 craziest wars of the second half of the 20th century. In the grand scheme of things that were happening in the 20th century with the two world wars, with all the decolonial wars, people often forget that the Soviets and the Chinese actually did go to war with each other. The war is known as the War of the Ussuri River. And while in the war only a few hundred people died, depending on the source, the Chinese claim that much less of their military died, but I don't think we should believe them. The Soviets claim that somewhere around 250 Chinese soldiers got killed, and for themselves somewhere around 100 Soviets probably died in this bizarre war. And while this war itself, it wasn't a long war, nor was it significant for the exchange of territory, but it was significant on an ideological level. And Archie Brown even mentions the Sino-Soviet split, that is a part of the bigger context in which this war happened. Archie Brown mentions it as one of the main reasons for the fall of communism in general. Because not only did the conflict of two most powerful communist countries, not only did it ruin the reputation of communism all around the world, but it also forced the Soviets to permanently have 40 divisions on their border with China, which was very economically draining for their economy. While the United States, on the other hand, had a privilege of having non-psychotic neighbors like Canada and Mexico. And they knew that Mexico isn't going to attack the United States, unlike the Soviets. Let me explain what happened. Why did these two countries go from friends to enemies? Well, somewhere in the late 1950s, with Khrushchev visiting the United States and trying to ease the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, Mao Zedong started to claim that the Soviets actually betrayed communism and all the third world nations that are still fighting against colonialism. And Mao Zedong also wanted to be the #1 anti-colonial country in the world. He wanted all the oppressed colonial countries to see him and not the Soviets as the #1 fighter against colonialism. And the Soviets did not appreciate Chinese competition. Not to mention that very soon Mao started to accuse the Soviets of being imperialists because of the concessions that were arranged under Stalin, in which the Soviet had access to Chinese tungsten mines. But what is interesting, Mao did not seem to think that these concessions were exploitative up until Khrushchev told him that he actually thinks that China shouldn't have nuclear weapons and that he is retrieving all the Soviet nuclear engineers from China. That is the point at which Mao actually suddenly realized that Khrushchev is an imperialist. And the Soviets, well, they definitely didn't appreciate that the communist movement now became fractured. But still, the Soviets, while they were kind of crazy, compared to Maoist China, they were pretty normal, moderate fellows. And Mao Zedong and his country entered a new period of craziness during the Cultural Revolution. And Mao Zedong, while he built railways all across Africa and helped many oppressed colonial peoples, he was brutally starving and murdering his own people. And the entire point of the Cultural Revolution was to wipe out all traces of Chinese past and build a completely new society. And the point of the Cultural Revolution was also to make a society more militaristic and give more power to the military when compared to the civil branches of government in China. And Mao Zedong, while he did hate obviously the capitalists and the United States, in the late 1960s, he began to see the Soviets as equally imperialistic, and old wounds and old territorial disputes were open. The Zhenbao Island is actually what triggered the war. Back in the 19th century, the Russian Empire claimed the Zhenbao Island from the Chinese Empire. And the Soviets, well, they actually believed in a different form of delineation between countries. They claimed that the border and the river should be at the point where the bottom of the river is the lowest. And that was the method used by some countries, while the Chinese actually claimed that the border should be in the middle of a river. And by that metric, the Zhenbao Island is Chinese, and by the other metric, it is Soviet. But in reality, the Soviets claimed the island and had their military patrol the island. And one day in 1969, Mao Zedong decided enough is enough. We have to claim back our holy Chinese soil. And Mao was also doing it to distract from all the internal problems in his country, all the great purges and violence that was happening in the countryside and in the streets of the Chinese cities. And so the Chinese ambushed the Soviets, and the initial attack was pretty successful because the Soviets simply didn't expect their communist neighbors to attack them. But what happened after is one of the craziest chapters in the history of Maoism, although it is overshadowed by all the other crazy stuff that Mao Zedong did, like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Well, Mao Zedong now became convinced that the Soviets will nuke him, or that they will attack his country with tanks, as they did in retaliation for this attack. They entered the Xinjiang region, but they never really tried to go further, deeper into China. But Mao was convinced that they will, which is why he started Operation Third Front. He ordered his people to mobilize all the important industrial facilities further inland, and here you can see how factories were built on top of hills, and he even ordered his military and his workers to dig out huge caves within mountains in order to put industrial facilities in them, because he was convinced that Soviets will just one day start bombing all his industrial facilities. And that didn't happen. All that happened is that Chinese lost thousands of workers and billions of dollars of cash on this pointless project, Operation Third Front, it was called. One of the few invasions in history that was completely justified was the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in 1978. The main point of this invasion was to stop the genocide of Vietnamese people that was done by the Khmer Rouge regime. But Pol Pot was a very ambitious person, and he did not only want to exterminate all the Vietnamese people, he also wanted to kill pretty much every racial minority in his country, because he believed blood pollution to be the main reason for the lack of this ancient greatness that used to make his country great. And while he did admire Mao Zedong, he saw Mao Zedong as a moderate person, and he criticized him as not having the guts to do the reforms that were necessary. That's why Pol Pot called his economic reform the super Great Leap Forward, because he, unlike Mao, will have the courage to destroy all the traces of capitalism and individualism within his society. And here you can see how the Khmer Rouge used to torture people. Van Nat is a great painter who was actually captured by the Khmer Rouge and forced to paint propaganda for his regime, and then later he drew paintings condemning the Khmer Rouge after he was liberated by the Vietnamese. And on this map you can see that Vietnam is a much bigger country that had 5 times bigger population. And if you realize that, then you can probably guess that attacking and provoking a country that's 5 times bigger isn't a good idea. But Pol Pot disagreed, and in his mad dream of restoring the ancient Cambodian Empire, he even started to attack Vietnam in the border regions and to genocide the Vietnamese population even within Vietnam. And Vietnamese military decided to invade in order to stop this madness. And Pol Pot was also famous for using child soldiers. And here you can see the ancient complex of temples, Angkor Wat, that for Pol Pot symbolized this ancient greatness of his country that was lost. And when the Vietnamese finally entered Pol Pot's country, and here you can see how Pol Pot dealt with the Cham Muslim population. He used to impale their heads on spikes. But even the ethnic Cambodian or the Khmer population disliked Pol Pot, because he had this brilliant idea of forcing all the people to leave the cities and live in the countryside, because he believed that cities corrupt people and make them worse. And he forced 90% of his country to live in the countryside. And Mare Mihovilovic, this great journalist that actually visited Cambodia and was the first news reporter that interviewed Pol Pot, he describes this eerie atmosphere in the abandoned cities where all you could see was lights in the middle of the night and huge empty streets. And the Vietnamese, while they were occupiers, they allowed people to return to the cities, and they allowed them freedom of religion, while Pol Pot, on the other hand, he outlawed all religion. And that is why the Vietnamese were actually seen as liberators even by most Cambodian people. But okay, now let's move on to the Bosnian War. And the Bosnian War, according to my professor from college that was an expert in the Bosnian War, according to him, the Bosnian War is one of the most absurd wars that happened in modern history. And why is that? Well, okay, let me explain how this war began. With the fall of communism, all ethnic tensions and animosities were released, and once back nationalism became a main ideology in Bosnia. And when Bosnia proclaimed independence from Yugoslavia in 1992, well, let's just say that Serbs disagreed, and Serbia did an invasion of Bosnia. And here is how the population of Bosnia looked like. So most people were Muslims, 43%, then we had 31% Serbs, somewhere around 20% Croatians, and others, and some people still claimed just to be Yugoslav. Well, what is absurd about this is that the Serbs, they had all the heavy artillery, all the tanks, they were the most well-equipped nation. And it really made no sense for Croatians and Muslims to go to war with each other while they are fighting a technologically superior enemy. But still they went to war with each other and created a complete mess and a shit show in Bosnia. Well, why did they go to war? Well, the Croatians and their leader Tudjman, he wanted a very decentralized Bosnia, while the Muslim leader Izetbegovic wanted a centralized Bosnia. But still, Muslims and Croatians could have postponed their differences while they are combating the Serbian military, but the conflict escalated because both sides wanted to take control of the explosives factory in the city of Gornji Vakuf. And the problem was also that Izetbegovic, the Muslim leader, who was a secularist, was unable to control the Mujahedin, the jihadis that came from Afghanistan, that were famous for decapitating the Croatian prisoners of war. And the Croatians were also unable to control some proto-fascist elements in their military, which also escalated the situation and ultimately led to conflict of these two communities. And from Croatian perspective, what is even more absurd is the fact that more Croatians, in Bosnia at least, died fighting the Muslims than the Serbs. But the Mujahideen, they weren't the only crazy ones. The Serbs had people like Arkan. Arkan was a mafia boss who also had his own paramilitary in Bosnia that massacred Croatians and Muslims, and he died in weird circumstances. Some think, well, he got shot, and some think that the Serbian dictator Milosevic killed him in a similar way in which Putin killed the Wagner leader, or others simply think that rival mafia gangs killed him. We'll never know, probably. And the Serbs in Bosnia are the only ones that actually committed what is internationally recognized as a genocide. The Srebrenica genocide, where 10,000 Muslims were killed in a few days in a very systemic way. Well, the Croatian military, they became famous for the Ahmići massacre, where they forced the Muslim population to enter a mosque and then they set it on fire and destroyed the mosque while burning all the people in it. And after that massacre, many Muslim commanders said, now we don't want peace with the Croatians, and they went to war with the Croatians. While on some battlefields, Muslims and Croatians still refused to go to war with each other. On other battlefields, they slaughtered each other at a much higher rate than they fought with the Serbs. But ultimately, the Clinton administration pressured Croatians and Muslims to make peace and provided them with air support, which then led to the Dayton agreements that are controversial because they gave a lot of autonomy to the Serbs, but ultimately they brought peace to a part of the world that desperately needed peace. This is how Bosnia looks today. But okay, now let me say something about the Six-Day War. What makes the Six-Day War so absurd and bizarre is the fact that Israel managed to win against much bigger and much more powerful opponents. While Israel had 100,000 man army, the Arab coalition consisted of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria had 240,000 man army, while Israel had 800 tanks. The Muslim coalition or the Arab coalition had 2,500 tanks, while Israel had 300 aircrafts. The Arab coalition had almost 1,000 aircrafts. And the war actually started with Nasser blocking the canal and mobilizing. Now, Egyptians to this day claim that they only wanted to send a message to Israel not to go to war with Syria, and there were border skirmishes between Israel and Syria happening, and Brezhnev also sent a new Soviet aircrafts to Egypt. So Egypt now wasn't technologically inferior to Israel like it was in the past wars that happened. Here you can see these Soviet aircrafts being sent to Egypt. But what is so fascinating about Six-Day War is how well executed this attack done by the Israelis was. So on the 5th of June 1967, Israel attacked, and they attacked precisely at the time when all Egyptian pilots had breakfast. Israel started to preemptively to bomb all the Egyptian Air Force, and most of the Egyptian aircrafts were destroyed in one day. In fact, 80% of their aircrafts were destroyed. And what was also very cunning about the way in which the Egyptian forces was destroyed was how the Israelis outmaneuvered the Egyptian military. Israelis knew that Egyptians will have fake planes on their airports, which is why the second wave of attack used heat-guided missiles. And precisely as Egyptian pilots started to enter their planes in order to combat the Israelis started to use heat-guided missiles, and hit-guided missiles, of course, will only hit real airplanes, not fake ones, because the fake airplanes do not produce heat. And Israelis, well, they also used rockets that explode only an hour after they entered the soil, which prevented the Egyptian workers from repairing the holes in the airfields. And that was also one of the main reasons for the Israeli superiority they had in the air throughout the entirety of this war. But Egyptians, they also did a great strategic mistake after the initial defeat of their aircraft forces. The Egyptian marshal ordered a retreat of all the Egyptian infantry, and many military analysts actually believe that that retreat was unnecessary and that the Egyptians were actually fighting pretty well, at least when it came to their infantry and tanks. But while they were retreating, the Israeli military managed to ambush them with napalm and kill 10,000 Egyptian soldiers. Not to mention an additional fiasco for the Egyptians was that by mistake their own artillery actually shelled their forces, which was additional humiliation for the Egyptian military, and Israel emerged victorious from the Six-Day War. And after this war they actually occupied the West Bank, and they decided to start with their project of building illegal settlements in the West Bank, which to this day still shapes the geopolitical map of the Middle East. And in a way, that decision in fact led to this last attack done by Hamas. But okay, now I want to tell you something about the Iraqi invasion of Iran. Iraqi invasion of Iran is one of those wars that perfectly captures the old saying, war is hell. This war was primarily caused by Saddam Hussein's mad dream of destroying their main Shia geopolitical rival. And Saddam Hussein also hoped that by capturing the Iranian oil fields, he will actually replace Egypt as the leader of the Arab world. And Saddam Hussein, in many aspects, he is the combination of Hitler and Stalin. He reminds me of Stalin when it comes to the great purges that he did of his own administration, and his extremely aggressive foreign policy reminds me of Hitler. And here you can see the real Iraqi propaganda posters. But if I had to find something good about Saddam Hussein, then it is the fact that his regime was secular. As bad as it was a secular regime, and some even argue that women and Christians and the Jews were treated better in Iraq under Saddam Hussein than they are today. And after the Iranian Revolution, Saddam Hussein was scared that this Islamist ideology will spread to Iraq, and Ayatollah Khomeini quite explicitly called all the Iraqi people to rise against their secular tyrannical government and establish a Muslim theocracy. And Saddam Hussein was especially worried that Shia Muslims will listen to the Ayatollah calling them to rise, which is why he decided to attack Iran. In a way, Iranians gave him a perfect excuse to do what he dreamed of doing for a long time, and that is stealing Iranian oil fields for himself. And he also realized that now at least the United States will not help the Iranians because of the revolution that happened. And in fact, the United States for most of this war actually helped Saddam Hussein. And what is bizarre about this war is when you see the geopolitical background behind it. So Iraq was helped by US, France and UK, while Iran was helped by the Soviets, China, Libya, Israel and North Korea. Yeah, truly one of the most absurd wars. Well, why did I in the beginning say that this war perfectly captures the old saying, war is hell? Uh, well, this war had all the perfect ingredients of hell. It had trench warfare, very similar to the horrors of World War One. It had bizarre Iranian motorcycle divisions used for ambushes. It had poisonous gas used by Saddam Hussein, a mustard gas. And the battle for the marshlands is one of those battles that is straight out of a horror movie. The marshlands, they might look beautiful from a distance, and when you see people living in the marshlands, it also looks beautiful. But then there is that iconic photography of an Iranian child soldier that got stuck in the mud. And in 1982, the Iranians, they actually managed to drive out the Iraqi imperialists from their country, and they started to advance into Iraq, but they had to pass through the marshlands. And Saddam Hussein used a cunning trick in order to kill the Iranian military. He just brought two giant generators to the marshlands, and he connected electricity to the water in the marshlands and just killed every single living being that was in the marshlands. And the corpses of the Iranian soldiers just began to float out of the marshlands, and you can even see a psychotic video of an Iraqi general laughing and showing to the Western news reporters the bodies of his enemies just floating on the surface of the marshlands. And this photography perfectly captures the hellish nature of this war, this young child stuck in the marshlands. And this horrible war also had a lot of urban warfare. And Saddam Hussein at first was able to utilize on the fact that Khomeini started to purge his own generals, and in the same way in which Hitler utilized the fact that Stalin killed some of his best Red Army generals, Saddam Hussein utilized on the very same fact, and the fact that the Iranians on paper were the fifth most powerful country in the world did not help them in the first years of this war. But this war actually managed to strengthen Iranian nationalism, and in the long run it became one of those national myths that consolidated the rule of Ayatollah Khomeini. But what is horrible about this war is that it was utterly pointless from the perspective of Iraq. All that Saddam Hussein achieved is thousands of dead on his side. Altogether, this war killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1,000,000 people. The borders just returned to their pre-war conditions. No side paid reparations to the other side, and altogether $1 trillion got wasted in this horrible war. And Saddam Hussein also genocided the Kurds in his country while waging this war. Well, war is hell is truly a true saying if you look at the Middle East in the 20th century. Okay, now if you like this video, please share, like and subscribe, and see you in the next video.